When I first started investing, I was pretty overwhelmed because there's this massive variety of financial products and it's easy to get lost and fall into analysis paralysis. And even though I already knew that I wanted a buy and hold investment strategy with well-diversified exchange-traded funds or short ETFs, still there are almost 9,000 different ETFs to choose from, and that doesn't even include the low-cost index mutual funds. So I read several books and articles on this subject, and I found 5 criteria to be helpful and important when picking an ETF. So I'm going to share those 5 criteria now with you. In the end, I mention a few other criteria that don't go into my decision, but they might into yours. Criterion number 1 is the index. So since I already knew I wanted to invest in index funds, that means funds that track a specific index, it kind of made sense to pick the index first. That's not absolutely necessary though, because you can also look that up in the product. It'll automatically show you the underlying index. It's still important to know though how the index selects their components and also how they're weighted. For example, there's market capitalization weighting and there's equal weighting. And it's also important to know the level of diversification of the index. So how many companies are in it? How many countries or regions? Now to look for an index or a corresponding product, and you're really a beginner, you can start with Wikipedia. It's only semi-professional, but at least it's easy. And if you go onto their homepage and you type in stock market index, which is the kind of indices we're talking about here, and then if you want, you can read a little bit about that, and at the end you will find list of stock market indices. Okay, now it here already says that this article has multiple issues, so we should not fully rely on this, but it can give us a head start. For example, if you stay only here at the top, it says global, and there you can already see a handful of indices that cover the whole world. Another website that I like to go to is justetf.com. This is especially for those of you who also live in Europe, because the regulations for ETFs in Europe are different than in the rest of the world. So this one is a good place to look. For those of you living in the US, I found ETF.com to give a good overview, because they also have a convenient search bar. And on both those websites, you will find a lot of ETF names. And I will do a quick anatomy of the fund name with you, because understanding their structure already can reveal a lot of information for you. So as an example, we will use the iShares MSCI ACWI UCITS ETF, ACC, and the Vanguard FTSE, also called FTSE, All World UCITS ETF, US dollars accumulating. So this first part, in this case iShares and Vanguard, that's the issuer. So who's the one who actually sells the fund? The second part is the name of the index that is replicated, and most of the time also who publishes the index. So that will be, for example, investment companies or stock exchanges. So here in our case it's MSCI ACWI, which stands for All Country World Index, and in the second example it's the FTSE All World. So that is our index here. The third part of the name will give us additional details about the ETF. So here in both the examples it's UCITS ETF. So here the name already tells us that it's really an ETF. And UCITS here is a regulation term that tells us that it fits the European regulations. And the fourth part of the name is the distribution policy of the ETF. So here they are both accumulating. Sometimes in the end there's also a D or a DIS or a DIST, and that stands for distributing. I'll come back to that later. Criterion number 2 is cost. And I would say cost is the most underestimated factor of investing from private investors, because costs also compound. And I will give you an example. Let's say we invest $50,000 one time for 20 years, and let's assume a return of 6% per year. Now if we have a fee of 0.2%, which is relatively typical for index funds, our overall cost over the whole 20 years will be less than $6,000. If we have a 1% fee, that cost goes up to around $27,700. That is more than 4 times the cost of the 0.2%. And if we even assume a 2% fee every year, that makes around $50,800 of overall cost. That's more than 8 times as much as with the 0.2% fee. So I cannot press this enough. Cost is very important. How do you look for it? In index funds, it's called the TER, the total expense ratio. And that means what the fund costs every year. And this number should be as low as possible. I would say everything up to 0 0.3% is good. Everything up to 0.75% is also still fine. Everything that's 1% or more, keep your hands off of that product. And you should also look for an entry fee. So in ETFs, there's usually no entry fee. There can be entry fees in mutual funds, so look out for them because they also diminish your returns. Criterion number 3 is the replication method. That is the way the fund tracks the index. And there's 3 different replication methods. The first one is physical replication. That means every company's stock from the index is bought into the fund. That's especially easy for indices that only contain like 30 to 100 companies. For bigger indices that sometimes contain several thousand companies, that can become difficult. That's why the second method is optimized sampling. That is when representative stock is bought into the fund. Let's say, for example, the FTSE All-World contains over 9,000 different companies all over the world. So for the last and smallest companies on that list, it can be difficult to buy their stock because there's not much available and the cost is also very high. So to keep a good performance, sometimes a few companies get left out. So it's pretty normal for big indices. And the third method is the swap-based replication. That means that they don't buy the stock from the companies in the index, but possibly from other companies that they think will exactly perform like the index. And a swap is basically an exchange between two parties. And with those swap-based funds, most of the time it's one investment company that swaps, for example, with their holding company or with their parent company. So that makes it still safe to invest. And it also enables to invest in indices that might be hard to physically replicate, for example, from third world countries. I personally, up until now, avoided those swap-based funds, but that's really a personal preference. Criterion number 4 is the distribution policy of the fund. And there are just 2 different types. So there's accumulating. That means that the dividends from the companies within the fund get automatically reinvested into the fund. That saves you time because you don't have to reinvest them yourself. And it also saves you money because with reinvesting yourself, most of the time there's transaction costs. And I think the most important point here is that it drives compound interest. The second type is distributing. That means that the dividends get paid. If, for example, you want to live off your dividends, that would be an option. Then you should also have a look on their distribution frequency, which means how often the dividends get paid. So, for example, once a year, once a quarter, or once a month, if that's relevant for you. Just let me make that note here. Your invested money will not compound in the same way when you get paid the dividends. So keep that in mind when choosing. And criterion number 5 is the fund size. It's also called AUM, assets under management. And it simply tells us how big the fund is money-wise. And the bigger the fund, the more liquidity there is. So that makes them very easy to sell and buy. And also with very small funds, it's possible that sooner or later they get integrated into a bigger one. There probably would not be any consequences to you, but if I, for example, find 2 ETFs that are almost equal and one of them has the bigger fund size or under management, I choose the bigger one. Now, all of those criteria I mentioned up until now you can find on the websites I already told you. You will also find their links in the video description, and you will also find them in the fact sheet of the ETF. And now there are 2 other factors that I don't consider important, but maybe you do. One is the tracking error, and the tracking error is basically the difference between the performance of the index and the performance of the fund. Now, since the index is just a list of numbers, it will always perform better because the fund then buys the components and therefore has all different kinds of costs. For example, transaction costs and also taxes. So the ETF or mutual index fund will naturally stray a little bit from the index. But because they are all doing their best to track the index, I consider it negligible and don't look at this factor. And another criterion or factor might be the issuer company. So if you trust one company that offers this product more than another company that offers the same product. By the way, if I research the ETFs I want to invest in, I make a list just like this, and there I put all the different criteria I explained to you just now. So the name of the index, then the replication method, then the cost of the fund size, and the distribution policy. And then I go through the list and look which one fits my criteria best. If you would like to find out how I feed my investments account as much as possible, you can check this video out next. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.